Well, it is good to see everyone this morning. We have a wonderful audience that has assembled together to worship God. We have visitors with us, and we're certainly thankful for your presence. And we hope that you are edified by the things that we do. We hope that you'll linger a few minutes after the service so that we can get to know you a little bit better. Suppose that I was to go out on the street out here and speak to the average person, if there is such a thing. And I said to them, have you heard of a young man in his early 30s who liked to dialogue with people, even those with whom he disagreed? And sometimes those discussions would actually upset people. But he appealed to truth. He believed in absolutes. And those absolutes would translate into morality, judgments about good and bad and how people live and what they do. And he would appeal to God as his absolute authority that rested behind those judgments. And then he suffered a violent death. If we ask someone, have you heard of such a person? They might respond and say, well, yes, I think I've heard that in recent days there was a man named Charlie Kirk who did that kind of thing. He liked to speak with people. Often disagreements would arise. And yet he appealed to truth and he appealed to God. And he died a violent death as a result of that. Several weeks ago on a Wednesday night, David Madrigal had a very thought-provoking talk in which he talked about this example. And then he used the example of Stephen over in Acts chapter 7, where Stephen got up and courageously spoke against his own detractors, his own Jewish people, and they ended up gnashing their teeth at him and stoning him to death because of what he said. And that certainly was a fitting example. And really, all of those examples made me think, even as I listened. And a couple of weeks ago, when there was this memorial service for Charlie Kirk, in which it was said that there are a lot of people who have decided because of his life and influence, they were going to go back to church, which I have to say in this current climate sounds encouraging in some ways, that people are actually thinking spiritual thoughts. But during all of that, I thought of Jesus. Isn't Jesus the very man who came and he spoke truth, and he spoke with people with whom he disagreed, and he challenged them about their beliefs, and he appealed to truth, and he spoke about what was right and wrong, and he spoke of his Father from whom that truth had come. And of course, his enemies ultimately put him to death. Now, why does that happen, we might ask? Why is it that someone seemingly so innocuous, or someone's so innocuous, so not intent on harm, would bring about that kind of reaction from some? And I think it has to do with the nature of truth. The Bible speaks about this relationship in a figurative way, light and darkness. Listen to what Isaiah says, an oft-quoted passage, chapter 5 and verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. He uses several different figures there, but the point being that these things are kind of opposite. And so why is it that a gospel message which is intended to be good news could be so construed to cause such harm? Well, I want to think with you about those thoughts this morning just for a few minutes. And I've just titled that this lesson, When Light Meets Darkness. Let's think of the light that is brought by the truth of God, whether it be the gospel or whether it be the teaching of the Bible, whatever form it might take. And why does it cause so often a great deal of opposition? And I've really just got 3 points this morning. My first point is that disobedience begets darkness. The Bible's very clear about the fact that God made us that we are made in his image, that we have a responsibility to live according to the way that he wants us to live. And yet, what we learn is that there is disobedience to that. It started in the garden, and it has taken place ever since. Now, as we think of that, why is that picture like it is, and how does the good news fit into this? I want to go to Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. And here Paul talks about the good news of the gospel, but then he goes back to why this good news is needed. And it's really the bad news of sin. And so as you look at Romans chapter 1, we're going to just look at a few verses there. Paul begins in verse 18, having said that the gospel is God's power to save. In verse 16, he writes, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." So God has revealed himself, his wrath. In other words, he's going to punish those who are ungodly and those who are unrighteous. And he says, notice, they suppress the truth. Now, how do you suppress the truth? What does that mean? Well, if you look up that word, suppress means to prevent, or to restrain, or to hide, or to block out the truth. Somehow, men who knew truth about God were suppressing that truth. Well, how did they do that? Listen to what Paul writes next. Verse 19, he gives us a first for in way of explanation. "For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them." Now, here's some truth that God has made known to men even from the very beginning. They're trying to suppress the truth, but God has made it plain. He has shown it. Now, how so? Look at verse 20. "For his invisible attributes." So here's some things you can't see. What are those invisible things? He says, even his eternal power and divine nature. Now think of those two categories. Power. Power has been manifested. But just as much as there is power, there is design, there is a divine nature, there is a person, there is a being behind that power. It's not just untamed power. Those are the invisible attributes that God has made known. He says, ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. Some versions have, they're clearly perceived. Michael couldn't have led a better song than the one that he led before the lesson. The spacious firmament on high, as we gaze at the sun that comes up during the day, and then we see the moon at night and the stars, and we see that all that is around them, that is a part of this creation that God has made available to every human being who has ever lived. And therefore, he has revealed that truth to them. But like we said, they have suppressed the truth. What did they do to suppress, to prevent the truth? Well, he continues down in verse 21, yet another for, the third one. "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him." Now, when one looks at the creation around us, it should bring about a glory and a gratitude and an honor to the one who has made it. Paul says they did not do that. They failed to honor him. They were ungrateful. They failed to give thanks for what he had done. And I believe in saying that and in demonstrating this, what he's saying is they tried to suppress this truth. They took God's truth, and instead of worshiping God, they began to make creatures like themselves, and they began to worship themselves. That's what idolatry is. We make our own gods and we worship them. And so Paul goes on in the rest of the chapter. We won't look at it in detail, but he says that unrighteousness is something to which God gave them up. Interesting phrase there. He uses it 3 times in the rest of Romans chapter 1. He gave them up. And notice the things to which he gives them up. Verse 24, he gave them up to impurity. He gave them up, verse 26, to dishonorable passions. He gave them up to a debased mind, verse 28, to do the things that are not fitting, the things that we ought not to do. In other words, the picture is kind of like somebody who's going to go wreck the car, and God says, here's the keys. If that's your disposition, if that's what you want to do, go right ahead. Now, tempered with the fact that God is going to bring his wrath against such disobedience. But God is not going to keep someone from doing what is opposed to his will if they choose to do such. And that entire picture is one of the darkness of sin. Disobedience begets darkness. Now, I want to spend just a moment here to give you a current equivalent, I think, of what Paul's describing in Romans 1. It's a modern day illustration. I don't read a lot of books. I'm not a great reader, but I have read this one. Someone recommended to me, Strange New World, written by Carl Trueman. Trueman is a believer in God, a believer in the Bible. He's a British professor who teaches here in the United States. And he has analyzed how our society, our culture, has come to change so radically over what seems to be such a short period of time. In fact, his book here is subtitled, How Thinkers and Activists Redefined Identity and Sparked the Sexual Revolution. Now, we're just going to take a little snippet of what he says here. But I want you to think of what he's saying related to what Paul says in Romans chapter 1. And so he starts out by defining the self. He says, traditionally, we think of the self as that basic consciousness we have of being an individual person. I am who I am. I am Matt Qualls. I'm an evangelist. I live in Temple Terrace, Florida. I'm not Jeff Bezos of Amazon. I'm not Donald Trump, who's the president of the United States. I am this person. And as that person, I am distinct from other people who are around me, but we are answerable to, I think, our culture up until a very short time ago, at least recognize some kind of higher moral authority. Of course, we would say that that is God himself. But society as a whole had the idea that there was some kind of moral authority by which we were to be guided. What Trueman says is that the idea of the self has changed, and it's interesting, it didn't change overnight. It changed over 300 years of thinking by philosophers, and as he says, activists. Well, what's the change that has come about? He says that the self now comes to mean someone looking at the self and asking the question, who am I? And guess how they answer that question? They ask that question not by looking outside to some objective standard, but by looking inside and saying, who am I? Well, what do I feel like? And in fact, my feelings are what make me authentic. And he describes this as individualism. The idea that each individual has the right to do what they want to do. In fact, he describes this as expressive individualism. And so for me to be truly authentic, they would say, I need to express my feelings in whatever way that I deem necessary. And as a result of that, that change in thinking has come about by philosophers. You've heard the names Freud or Marx, maybe Rousseau. We won't go into all that detail, but the groundwork has been laid for people to think the way that they do. Now, from Paul's standpoint, they've just turned away from God, rightly so. But this is how people think, and this is how they act. As a result of which, we mentioned earlier, he mentions in his subtitle, the sexual revolution. If you look up that term, it's defined as a social movement that challenged traditional codes of behavior related to sexuality and interpersonal relationships throughout the Western world from the late 1950s to the early 1970s. That means that if you're in your 60s or 70s, like I am, you have witnessed in your lifetime the changes that have come about that seem so very radical. What changes are we talking about? What about sex outside of marriage? No commitment. When I was growing up, that was uncommon. That was frowned upon. It is today accepted as the norm, is it not? That's what people do. In fact, you're an oddball if you don't do that, at least initially, before you marry. The same could be said for homosexuality. And the point that Truman makes is that the change is not simply that barriers have been pushed outward and expanded. That certainly has happened. But he says what's radical about this is that those barriers are now looked upon as really having no right to exist. Who are you to judge me in the kind of lifestyle that I want to lead? And I would be looked down upon if I were to judge in some way someone else's lifestyle. And so whether it's homosexuality, whether it's promiscuity, it has to do with how we feel. And I think that's sometimes reflected in the way people talk. Instead of saying, well, I believe that's wrong, they say, well, that just makes me feel uncomfortable. You see how the feelings become the basis for what it is that people are doing? And he mentions about the confluence, the coming together of so many different things. I mean, you can think over the last 30, 40, 50 years. The pill that made it easy to separate sex from procreation. Magazines that present promiscuity as cool and attractive lifestyle for both men and women. No-fault marriage, which makes marriage reduced to something like a sentimental bond. While you can break it up if you need to, it might make some people unhappy, it might affect your family, but nothing wrong with that. Or the rhetoric of feminism, which asserted women's control over their bodies and over sexuality. And what about the internet that has expanded the accessibility of pornography, almost negated any kind of social stigma against it? And even just TV with its sitcoms, soap operas, even the commercials have made this kind of lifestyle something that's acceptable, kind of a recreational pastime. And of course, Truman wasn't talking about this one, but how much has this embraced all of these things we're talking about? Our cell phones, social media. And so the point is that if these things are left to express themselves without any kind of control, why, it just gets bigger and it gets worse. And as I say, that seems to me a little bit like Romans 1. That's what happens, that's what has happened throughout the history of the world. And into that history, God has brought the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. So let's make our second point, very simply, that darkness often despises light. It brings about the conflict that we've witnessed. We witness it in the crucifixion of Jesus, but we witness it in modern day events, as we have suggested. Look at what, and here I've just tried to picture that. If this unrighteousness is growing and God has brought the gospel and there are those trying to live by it, you're going to have this conflict between the two. Listen to what Jesus said, our scripture reading, John chapter 3, 19 to 21. This is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. For everyone who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his work should be exposed. It's like turning the light on and all the bugs scatter, don't they? They don't want to see the light. But whoever does what is true comes to the light so that it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. John 15, Jesus preparing his disciples for what was coming before his crucifixion, verse 18. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you are of the world would love you as its own, but because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. There is this conflict that exists between the two. And then in Jesus' prayer to his Father, John 17, verse 14, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. Protect them. Help them. And so if that's true, where does that leave us? We're trying to do what's right. We're trying to be righteous according to God's word. And there is darkness in our world. There always has been. And those two clash and come into conflict with each other. What are we to do? Well, my third and final point is to take some statements of Jesus and to suggest that our light can penetrate that darkness. And I want to go with you over to the Gospel of Luke. We've been studying that in a high school class, and we've been studying the different sections of that gospel, and one of those major sections is in chapter 9, starting at verse 50, all the way to chapter 19. We're calling it Jesus' Journey to Jerusalem. And if you look at verse 50, actually 51, it says, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, that's his crucifixion, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Jesus was headed to Jerusalem, not just as a geographic destination, he was going there to die. And so on the way, he was training his disciples, particularly his apostles, as to what they should be prepared for. And let's suggest some of the principles that he used with them. There in chapter 9, verse 62, Jesus said to him, this is some questioner, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom. So if we're going to follow Jesus, we've got to be committed to Jesus, who he is, what he does. Wherever he leads, as we sing, I will follow. And so we're in it 100%. We have to give ourselves to him. Secondly, we're going to have to trust him. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus sends out the 12. And I want you to listen to what he says to them. Verse 2, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. Verse 3, go your way. Behold, I am sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. Sound like what we've been talking about? But then listen to his instructions. Here they're going out to do this work. Verse 4, carry no money bag, no knapsack, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. You wouldn't want to go camping with Jesus, would you? He doesn't prepare very much. He said, don't take anything with you. Well, why not? He says, whatever house you enter, first say, peace be to this house. And if a son of peace is there, your peace will rest upon him, but if not, it will return to you. And remain in the same house, eating and drinking what they provide, for the laborer deserves his wages. Do not go from house to house. Whenever you enter a town and they receive you, eat what is set before you. In essence, what he's saying is, don't take a bunch of provisions like you're going camping. You just go with the shirt on your back and you enter into any house that will accept you. And if they don't accept you, you go to the next house. In order to do that, one would have to trust Jesus, that he's going to provide for me. He's going to take care of me, whatever the obstacle may be. What if someone rejects me? We'll drop down to verse 16 of chapter 10. The one who hears you hears me, and the one who rejects you rejects me, and the one who rejects me rejects him who sent me. If someone rejects the gospel, they're rejecting ultimately the one who sent out the gospel, God himself, his son, Jesus Christ. And so it's necessary for us to trust him in order to be light. A third point, chapter 12, verses 4 and 5. Jesus says, I tell you, my friends, do not fear those who kill the body, and after that have nothing more that they can do. I think we all know what fear and what danger is. And we're aware of that. We're conscious of it. We try not to put ourselves in positions where that's going to take place. And yet, even then, what we have to do, we have to trust Jesus and not be fearful. He says, in fact, verse 5, I will warn you whom to fear. Fear him who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Over in Matthew's account, Jesus says to his apostles, what I whisper in your ear, you go shout on the rooftops. And then he cites this passage. He says, they may kill you for what you're preaching, but you trust the one who can truly judge, who can truly destroy. And so do not be fearful. He tells them they need to speak the truth. Now, not in so many words, but over in chapter 12, the verses that follow what we just read, verse 8, and I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man also will acknowledge before the angels of God. But the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. Have you ever been in a group of people? Maybe a discussion was taking place, or maybe some hand count was taken concerning maybe some moral principle. Do you believe that or not? And you would have been in the minority to raise your hand. It's tough to do in that situation, isn't it? But Jesus says, if you acknowledge me before men, I'll acknowledge you before my Father. I'm willing to do that. And in speaking truth, we don't have the same means by which truth is to be spoken. Verses 11 and 12 of chapter 12. Jesus said to them, when they bring you before the synagogues and the rulers and the authorities, do not be anxious about how you should defend yourself or what you should say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in that very hour what you ought to say. Now, you can read in the book of Acts where Peter and others had that ability based upon the Spirit telling them what to say. I don't believe we have that power, that ability. Jesus hasn't promised it to us, but we do have by inspiration his word. And we can use it for the basis of our thoughts. And we can speak truth to others. And when we speak that truth will penetrate the darkness that is around us, even if it is in opposition to us. Well, a couple of other thoughts before we close. Jesus talks in chapter 14 about counting the cost. And if you remember there, we won't read it. He talks about you can't be my disciple unless you're willing to hate father, mother, wife, etc. Unless you're willing to bear your cross, unless you're willing to renounce all that you have. I think those are all part of the same picture. You must be willing to totally commit yourself to me. And to do so, he says, you need to count the cost. Like a man that's going to go build a tower, do I have the materials necessary? Like a king that's going to go out to battle, I've got 10,000 soldiers. My opponent has 20,000. Do I have what it needs to fight this battle? And really, I don't think the point is so much to say, what are my resources? As much as to say, I really can't rely upon myself. I need God's help. I need to count the cost and rely upon God for what he can provide for me. And then finally, we'll go back up to the top because that's where it appears in the text. Again, sort of in an indirect way, I think what Jesus says to his disciples is, when you go out and you speak the truth and you're committed, you need to be loving in what you do. You remember that just after it says he set his face to go to Jerusalem, that they were up in Samaria and the Samaritans didn't like the Jews and vice versa, but it said he sent his disciples into a town and the Samaritans wouldn't accept him because his face was set. He was going to Jerusalem. And guess what James and John said? Verse 54, and when his disciples, James and John, saw it, they said, Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Why, we can take care of them in a moment. Surely you can do that. And the next verse says, he turned and he rebuked them. When we offer truth, we're to do it in a loving way. How many times have we said that? We're not seeking to destroy someone, we're seeking to help someone and correct someone. The adversary is the devil. He's the one who's behind all of this. But we're doing all that we can to be of help. Well, those are some principles about which Jesus speaks. And so our thought is, what we need to do when light meets darkness is we need to be the light. Many passages that say that very thing. And so we'll close this morning by asking the question, am I light? Am I exuding that light as I go through my daily schedule? Am I willing to stand up for the truth? Do I express my belief in that objective standard, which is God's word? Am I willing to reason with others, though there may be disagreement? Am I willing to show them the love that is needed? Those are all questions that we can ask ourselves. I remember being in a society when I was in college, and it was called Arete. And I think the guys I was in that society with, all we were concerned about was winning at flag football. But that word, arete, in Greek means moral courage. It's translated virtue. Add to your virtue all diligence. Give diligence to add to your virtue, knowledge. Moral courage, that's really what we're describing this morning. It takes courage to stand up and to do what's right. And so I would simply invite you to ask the question, and I had it on there, I guess. Am I light? Am I living that way? Am I conducting myself in that way? If I'm not a part of the light, then I need to be. Paul describes being delivered from the kingdom of darkness and translated into the kingdom of the Son of his love. If that's your desire this morning, we've chosen this song of invitation to encourage you to make that step, to be part of the light that God is willing to shine upon us. If that's your desire, won't you come this morning as we stand?